the subsidy for solar or for wind and solar energy is going to be there next year. And so you see today a marked drop-off in the number of wind projects. Recognizes the reality of creative destruction and the reality of economic dynamism. You don't know what the technologies are going to be there in 20 years. You can't have politicians and committees determining industrial policy. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work because the economy is dynamic. The people who are actually doing things may respond to tax policy, but they will respond a whole lot better if you don't distort the economy in the process. And tax revenues can be recycled. They can be recycled into payroll taxes, into reductions of income taxes. They can be recycled into development programs for the third world, which solves the equity problem and other kinds of ways. Now, how do we do this? We are embarking on a new round of negotiations to replace Kyoto, and this needs to be done by 2012. And everyone assumes that everyone's got to buy into this. You can't do what the Chinese won't agree to. That creates a rather low, a lowest common denominator kind of constraint. I don't think we have the time to do that. If we look at game theory, we might find a solution. Robert Axelrod in 1984, in looking at the prisoner's dilemma, came to the conclusion that the tit-for-tat strategy encourages cooperation. That is, in every round, this is a two-person, two alternative game where you cooperate or you don't cooperate, and the payoff matrix is such that you get a positive payoff if you cooperate. If you don't cooperate, you may get a higher payoff or nothing, or a negative payoff, depending on what the other person does. But it came to the conclusion with empirical tests that if in every round you do what your opponent did in the previous round, that over time you wind up with a cooperative solution every time, and the maximum and a higher long-term payoff. It discourages opportunism and it builds trust. Robert Keohane, 2 years later, put forward the thesis that cooperation can be institutionalized through regime arrangements that increase certainty and credibility. That is, you start small and you increase the breadth of activity over time. And there's a lot of examples of that. We don't need to go into it. But one way to do that in climate is to adopt standards by the industrial world, which are then sort of imposed on everyone else. Now, it doesn't sound democratic, but this is a point where you need some leadership. You adopt a soft regulatory regime, which consists primarily of carbon taxes or taxes on greenhouse gas emissions. It need not be multilateral in the beginning, as the United States, the Europeans, and the Japanese can do this by themselves if they have to. That is, negotiations are good, but negotiations are better if there's a hammer in the wings. Now, dealing with settling water conflicts among various claimants for irrigation water, for example, between fish and Indian tribes and irrigators and hydro and surface and groundwater users. One major settlement that was achieved in Idaho a few years ago came about because everyone was involved in a lawsuit where there was going to be a winner and a lot of losers. And no one wanted to be on the losing side of that, and no one could predict for sure how it was going to come out. And so they reached a settlement that worked out. So it helps to have a hammer in the wings. But you can adopt a regime, preferably a tax regime, and on the basis of trade, you can enforce it on China, on India, on anyone else. And I don't think you'd wind up having to do much enforcement, but the Chinese would be very vulnerable to it. The United States currently enforces labor and environmental law through Super 301 and Special 301 reports to Congress by the United States Trade Representative. This can be extended to a carbon regime. California, as another example, has imposed its environmental regulation on much of the United States simply because the California economy is so large that automobile manufacturers, for example, will choose to meet the California standards rather than make two different vehicles for different markets in the United States. And with that, I will turn it over to Haider and hope I haven't taken too much time. Does this turn off if I? Okay. Let's leave it. Thank you. Yes. The discussant this morning is Haider Khan, who is a professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at the Corbell School at Denver University. His degrees are from Cornell, or Denver, yeah. Degrees are from Cornell, and he focuses on technology, energy, and development, and on innovation and growth in East Asia. And he has been an advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations with regard to UNCTAD. So please come take the floor.
I'll just speak from here since I'm not going to use the overhead projector. I think we have heard an excellent presentation from Dick Slaughter. I certainly have learned much from his papers and also his presentation this morning. There are broad agreements, I think, here. We are both economists, so one cannot expect too much disagreement where markets are involved. On the other hand, I think there are probably some philosophical disagreements as well as some disagreements in detail and perhaps methodology. So I will try to clarify some of these things. But first, the agreements. I think I could not agree more with Richard when he said that climate change is probably the most important security issue globally. And that, I think, is clearly something that we have to keep in mind when we discuss any of the alternatives. I also agree that the Kyoto Protocol is really a political compromise and of the sort that may be defended on some political grounds, but it does not always make very good economic sense. And I would argue that what we need is modeling work inspired by fundamental economic considerations of the sort that Richard presented this morning, some of which is undergoing, but they are not always that satisfactory, so I will mention something specific about them as we go along. One thing, however, that I think we should keep in mind that all taxes are distortionary. There is no tax that does not distort individual incentives and behavior. The question then becomes what tax is more efficient and what addresses the problem at its source more effectively than the other. And there, I would agree that a global tax properly conceived and instituted is a better alternative than a bunch of local taxes where the governance structure is not really clear. But I think the real question is how far can even a global tax regime go in addressing the serious security problem that climate change actually poses to us. So let me, with that as preamble, divide my remarks in 5 parts. In the first part, I will discuss some modeling aspects, make some suggestions. In the second part, I will say a few words about where game theory can help us, especially the more recent developments in game theory can help us. In the third part, I will discuss something that he didn't really mention so much in the talk, but it's in the paper, individual versus corporate behavior, especially what I would term green corporate governance. And environmental and sustainability accounting, both at the micro and macro level. In the fourth part, I will actually extend this. Instead of, as I said, nitpicking, I want to really put the larger picture. So I will discuss one set of projections and scenarios, and then draw some conclusion. And finally, I think the real issue really is with respect to big countries like China, India, perhaps Brazil, and certainly Russia. So I think I want to focus a little bit on that and argue that while we are doing the efficient thing, we should not penalize the poor within these countries as well as poor countries. And I have a few suggestions, so I will finish in that way. In terms of modeling aspects, I think even if one agrees that a global tax regime is better on theoretical grounds, as I'm largely inclined to do, although we do have disagreements about the scope and reach and nature of economic theory that I don't want to go into right now, we need numbers that actually can pose counterfactual questions. If you impose this type of tax and this amount of tax, what would be the resulting decrease in emissions? That would be one question that we want to ask. And we can basically use two kinds of models. One would be a global econometric model, and the other one would be a global computable general equilibrium model. And variants of both really exist, but and different people are using them. At the UN, there are models. The Dutch have a model. The Scandinavians have models. But the problem is that the issue that Richard poses, the global tax, has not really been posed in the way that they need to be posed. We do have country models where people have posed it. I am doing it for China and for India that I will mention at the end. But I think this is something that must be done before we can draw firm conclusion, before we can hope to actually persuade the global audience and key policymakers in various organizations. The second theme is that game theoretical aspects. Axelrod's work is very good, but it is not really theoretical. It is basically a lot of simulations, and what he does within that is marvelous. But more recent models of both cooperative game theory and evolutionary game theory suggest that there could be learning of more explicit sort. I myself have done some where I use a neural network fuzzy set theoretical model. People think in a fuzzy way, we all know that, but for a long time we couldn't really formalize it, ask the question mathematically. And thanks to the work done on fuzzy set theory, we can. And people learn also because we form new neural connections in our brain. And neural network theory is trying to ask how can we learn from our past mistakes? And again, the work is not all that advanced, but it is much more advanced than, say, it was 20 years ago. And in my book on financial crisis, I have used one variety of this model, and I have shown that it is possible to learn to cooperate. And the third type of model that I think is related and is very encouraging is the kind of model where we have communication, explicit communication and signals going from one actor to another. So strategic interaction has a different meaning. Instead of seeing yourself as kind of individual ego and atomistic agent, you actually extend the sense of who you are. You see yourself as a member of community, first maybe small and then large, and ultimately perhaps the global community. And this kind of game theory, I think, can offer a lot of hope for the future, given that we have a serious problem, and as Richard correctly points out, we don't have that much time to really bigger and really work from narrowly defined so-called national interests of countries where, in point of fact, national interest is really defined from the very narrow perspective and goals of an elite. Even in the so-called democratic countries, I think this is true. And certainly in more authoritarian countries, this is very much true. In my personal experience in working in Asian Development Bank with Japanese officials in Tokyo and conversations in Beijing, I have found that many of the older generation leaders really do not understand the problem of environment at all. Japanese would tell you, we developed and polluted and then it's all cleaned up and now we are great. So what's the problem? Why do you want to talk about environment at all? That is one view from the older Japanese developmentalists. But of course, there's a newer generation of Japanese who have very different views, which should give us hope for China, because China also is developing a new generation of leaders, and India is also developing a new generation of leaders. My third point is about individual versus corporate behavior, and I'll be very brief. Of course, both types of behaviors are important, but a corporate entity is a special kind of entity. It is a social entity first and foremost, but we have defined corporations largely as entities that should maximize shareholder value. And that's a very narrow definition of corporate governance. In Europe, in particular, people are trying to define corporate governance as stakeholder governance, which means that you must have a board of directors which you draw from all constituencies, including employees and community people and others as well. In my work with Professor Cabi at Sorbonne and Professor Pinheiro in Spain, we have tried to use an environmental accounting for the firm's balance sheet itself. And in my other work, I have tried to use it for society as a whole. And here too, I think we have some hopeful messages to deliver. At the individual individual level at the firm, when you actually show that firms must internalize those external costs, you get a much truer picture of what the firm is doing as a social entity or not doing. At the level of people, if you take the society as a whole and do green accounting, then basically you have to subtract the cost of pollution. And now just assume for a moment, very conservatively, that this damage is distributed equally to everybody in society. I have called this equality of misfortune assumption in one of my papers. And you can show by using the standard approaches to the measurement of inequality and poverty that when you do accounting in the right way, in the green way, then the actual degree of inequality and poverty are much higher than they appear to be. The implication is that if you address the environmental issues, you also address, to some extent, not to 100%, but to some extent, the issue of inequality and poverty. And especially if you get rid of my equality of misfortune assumption and assume that poor actually suffer more from these issues, then the gain would be even larger. So here, fortunately, efficiency and equity really do not work in different directions. They work in the same direction. But let's look at the larger aspects, because markets can only do so much as institutions. This is something I think we have to understand. Markets are a relatively recent innovation in human history, and they have done a lot in terms of increasing production and increasing wealth and material comfort for a lot of people. Although the gains have been, one must say, unevenly distributed, it has not been able to do away with poverty and inequality. One might actually argue that markets do have a tendency to generate inequality left to themselves. But that is not the issue with respect to environment. With respect to environment, the issue is that we can only do so much through taxes, even global taxes. And the problem is much, much more serious. The projections and scenarios that we have, for example, the global scenario group in Stockholm, they have come up with basically three broad scenarios. One is the conventional market approach, including a kind of Keynesian reformist approach. Second one is barbarization. That is, we just let market forces run rampant, do nothing, no taxes, no changes. And then we really will destroy ourselves, because the forces that are destroying the environment, especially climate change issues, they are nonlinear, and they increase after some point very, very dramatically. And then we won't have much time to work. Then they have a great transition scenario, the third scenario, where they talk about new sustainability, which is kind of a John Stuart Mill type of gradual reform to a more cooperative society, and an eco-communalism solution, where we actually expand our awareness and build new institutions of cooperation. Now, I think that I want to see a series of interconnected steps. I think we can start with something like global taxes. Creating a global regime actually would be very tough. One should not underestimate the difficulties. If we can get there, then let's think about new sustainability type of paradigms. And then when we get there and increase our consciousness further, we can actually think about a much more cooperative and harmonious society once we have actually averted some of the more immediate disastrous scenarios. Let me just finish by mentioning briefly some work that I've been doing on China and India. On China, I have a paper on energy and environment that you can find on the web. I show that if China continues its present way of doing things, then it will be not only a disaster for China, but really for the region and perhaps for the world. And India is behind, but not that far behind, given the ambitious agenda the leaders have set. So I think China and India really need to change their ways. And fortunately, in China at least, among the top leadership, there is this recognition, and they even have passed laws. But the problem is that at the local level, people just ignore them. So it really is a governance issue there within China. India actually has more enlightened policymakers and has a better system of communication. It is the world's largest democracy, after all, but it needs to be very, very careful. I think Brazil and Russia, we have to really look at very carefully, especially Russia's extractive industries that are very polluting. It was a mistake, I think, to allow Russia to do what Russia has been allowed to do. But we have to be very careful that in the process we do not punish the poor people in these countries. And I think we can do things both internationally in terms of transfer of resources, but again, governance has to be right, because in my other work with my colleagues on foreign aid, I have found that unless the regime really is a socially oriented and developmentally focused regime, most of the foreign aid ends up being bureaucratic expenditures, as you also observe, Richard. I think we should make also a distinction between the least developed countries, the very poor countries, which are not really culprits, but have to, at the same time, be clear that every country has to follow a sustainable development policy. Because ultimately, the purely growth-oriented policies really are no longer viable for any country. It does not address either the issue of efficiency in a sustainability sense or the issue of equity. So I think we have to keep this long-run view in mind, keep these distinctions in mind, and follow a firm but flexible policy.
Thank you, Haider. Let me just respond to two or three things here and not get too far into detail. Starting with your last comment, I couldn't agree more. You can't, it seems difficult to exempt for social or equity purposes entirely, where you can, in fact, create a regime in which, in this instance, tax funds get recycled into places where they will do good with regard to infrastructure, with regard to institutional development, with regard to things that are necessary to bring very poor countries out of their poverty. And I have done some work on that. I don't want to take an aside into that. Two areas where I think we may disagree a little bit. I want to move away from the distinction between competitive markets and regulation for outcomes, which tends to be the distinction that is made, that you can't depend on competitive markets alone to get you to the right result. And I can't agree more with that, because the institutional structure and the sideboards on the markets lying behind what we think of as competitive markets are insufficient. Nothing could illustrate that more than the events of the last couple of months with regard to the financial markets. We've had people making a whole lot of money in financial derivatives, and without going into definition of those, Warren Buffett described a couple of years ago as financial instruments of mass destruction, for very good reason. Because while you had a free ability to create an asset, you had absolutely no way for society to avoid the cost of something going wrong with that asset. And in this instance here, I would argue that the institutional structure in place determines the payoff matrix from markets. So if you assume that a competitive market, and I don't have the matrix I use to talk about competition versus regulation and process, wasn't in this presentation. But if you have what we normally think of as a competitive market, what happens in Douglas North's terms is that we tend to internalize the benefits and externalize the costs. And what a climate regime has to do, among other things, is to bring those costs inside the market. And I think that a tax, well designed, has to be a fundamental part of such a structure, because while you do want to impact corporate behavior, you also need to impact individual behavior. And I do have to possibly disagree a bit with the descriptions of corporate governance and what's desirable from corporate governments. It's very desirable to have corporations thinking of social requirements and social ends and internalizing these inside. But if their competitors don't do the same thing, it tends to not work out. So if you're going to have corporations recognize environmental costs in terms of their day-to-day decisions, you almost have to do it through a global regime, at least within a country, but in a regime that impacts not every company in about the same way, so that you don't wind up with people being green to their own detriment. Now, of course, that doesn't always have to happen. The 3M company, which makes adhesives and glues and et cetera, and prior to the Clean Air Act, emitted an awful lot of volatile hydrocarbons, discovered after the Clean Air Act was put into effect that capturing those hydrocarbons and reusing them was a whole lot cheaper than buying new virgin feedstock. That it was, it was a positive gain from that, and there's a whole lot of gains to me made along those lines. With regard to the other things that Haider has mentioned, I couldn't agree more, and I really appreciate your comments. I would open it up for questions. I think, given that there are only two of us, we could probably wrap this up in about another 20 minutes. Yes, Jim.
I'm Jim Cole from Metropolitan State College and the Cornell School. It seems as if what you're really talking about, when we get into the tax concept, is following up the argument in environmental discourse of the polluter pays in a framework. And you're using a tax policy to essentially set a price mechanism so that the market, or part of it, will the market price then accurately reflect the external, the total cost of the product, and therefore then make the kind of competitive playing field that wind power will be competitive with coal, because coal is accurately reflecting the total cost.
Yeah.
I was thinking in particular recently with the high cost when the oil prices shot up, what was it, $140 a barrel, there was always this tremendous interest, oh, now we can afford to invest in wind power, et cetera. So is this some way then that you're coming back into a price mechanism that will be applicable globally, because it does have to be applicable globally, because it affects China, India, and these other countries. Is that where you're seeing this thing work itself out in terms of, say, a market analysis?
This is the way that I see it working out. It seems to me that it's a whole lot better to price the emissions you don't want than to subsidize the behavior you do want. So we have a lot of tax incentives and a lot of subsidy of green energy and green buildings and so on. I'm not sure why you can't get the same result, in fact, a much more efficient result, if you simply price the carbon. Because then you automatically have a price advantage for solar, for wind, for nuclear, for anything that doesn't emit carbon. Now the level of that, going to one issue that Haider raised, is unknown, because if you do it through a tax mechanism, you institute a known cost, although I'm not sure that's totally true, because over time the cost will tend to be a whole lot less than the initial calculations. And you have an uncertain effect. And if you do a cap, then you have on the surface a certain effect at an unknown cost. I guess I suspect that when you do the cap, you may have a certain effect on paper, but you don't have a certain effect in practice, because there are all kinds of ways to game the system. I have to agree fully with Haider that a tax regime has to be very carefully designed, because you, as part of a regime that includes development funds, it includes all kinds of ways of recycling money back into the economies in such a way that you don't create massive future further distortions, and you certainly don't tilt the playing field against the poorest countries in the system.
Let me just add something to that. I fully agree with what Richard said. Let me just add, however, that adoption of new technologies, including green technologies, is a bit more complicated than simply getting price incentives. Schumpeter knew this when he talked about creative destruction. Even Solow, who wrote, when we had energy crisis for the first time after that in 1974, about backstop technology and how if the price gets high enough, there will be more extraction. He wasn't really thinking about pollution as much as just supply of oil and new technologies to use for that purpose. But I think we have to remember that first of all, in the developmental phase, which is technically called the pre-competitive phase of technology, there is a role for public policy and for example, government-sponsored labs. All the countries that actually have innovation systems understand that, and they have those. The second issue is that investments are usually lumpy. And as Richard pointed out, the future gains are uncertain. So in a perfectly competitive market, you may never see that kind of innovation. On the other hand, when you have market distortion, then you have other problems that you have to really confront. So it's not a very clean issue in that sense. One compromise would be for the government to support the pre-competitive phase and then get it to competitive phase through private sector firms and make sure that there will be adequate amount of research and development and supply of technology. But the issue really is fascinating and very complex. This is what I discuss in my book on innovation and growth.
John.
I'd like to just support this initiative from a slightly different perspective, which is that on a fundamental Pigovian approach, one of the critical problems in any alternative to a uniform pricing approach is that we have uniform imposition of costs as far as geographic distribution. These are global impacts. And I very much would like to see refinement of the distribution of the revenues following Professor Khan's, I think, important observation of the inequality of distribution of costs on individuals. What we're approaching through